World War II aviation is full of legends, sleek fighters, massive bombers, and aircraft that reshaped combat. But there's another category of planes that history tends to forget: the bargain bin machines. Built with compromises, powered by weak engines, or simply never wanted in the first place, they tell a different story. And among them, few stand out more than Germany's Henschel Hs 129, the ground attacker that never lived up to its ambition. When we think of bargain bins, we picture dusty shelves of unsold products marked down for quick clearance. In aviation, the metaphor works surprisingly well. Some aircraft were built in large numbers, only to find themselves quickly outdated. Others were hampered by faulty designs or too many compromises. These machines became the forgotten stepchildren of the air war. For the United States, this meant planes like the Curtiss P-40 or the Boeing B-17. Produced in staggering numbers, they were vital early in the war, but faded as newer, more advanced designs took the stage. Many never even saw combat, rolling off assembly lines only to be stored or scrapped, a literal bargain bin of wings and engines. Germany, however, faced a different kind of scarcity. With limited resources and increasing Allied pressure, they needed to squeeze every bit of production value they could. That meant creating planes that didn't compete for high-demand engines or metals. Bargain bin logic applied not to mass overproduction, but to deliberate design choices, crafting aircraft out of what was left. The Henschel Hs 129 embodied this philosophy perfectly. Instead of fighting for Daimler-Benz inlines or BMW radials, it was assigned to use an engine that nobody wanted. Instead of aerodynamic elegance, it was heavily armored, bulky, and cramped. It wasn't designed to be glamorous, it was designed to exist. And in many ways, it became the ultimate bargain bin aircraft, not because it was unnecessary, but because it was built from parts too weak, too awkward, and too overlooked to power anything else. The idea for the HS-129 didn't spring from nowhere. Germany's experience in the Spanish Civil War had shown that dedicated ground attack aircraft could wreak havoc. While the Luftwaffe leaned heavily on dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka, they also saw value in strafing runs and low-altitude assaults. A dedicated flying tank seemed like a natural next step. The Reich Air Ministry issued a request in 1937. They wanted a twin-engined aircraft, small but heavily armored, capable of absorbing punishment from anti-aircraft fire. It needed cannons, machine guns, and the ability to drop bombs on troop concentrations and light vehicles. On paper, this was a practical request. In practice, it came with a catch. Germany's premier engines, Daimler-Benz 601s, BMW 801s, Junkers Jumo series, were already earmarked for fighters and bombers. These power plants were the crown jewels of the Luftwaffe, and no ground attack plane was going to siphon them away. So the ministry had a workaround: mandate the use of engines that were available but unwanted. The Argus 410 became the chosen compromise. Small, underpowered, and still in development, it was intended for light utility aircraft rather than combat machines. At just 460 horsepower, it paled in comparison to engines powering frontline fighters. But it was available, and that was all that mattered. This decision revealed Germany's thinking. The HS-129 wasn't meant to be a premier war machine. It was meant to be a resource-efficient solution. Instead of competing with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, it would exist in its own category, a cheap bruiser built to make do with scraps. Unfortunately, that philosophy of compromise would haunt the aircraft from the very beginning. When Henschel began work on the HS-129, the challenges were clear. The plane had to be heavily armored, almost like a flying tank, yet it was saddled with engines that barely qualified for frontline duty. The design team's solution was brute simplicity: build small, build tough, and cram the pilot into what space remained. The cockpit was infamously tiny. Pilots joked that they had to squeeze themselves into it with barely enough room to move their arms, let alone scan their instruments. Visibility was poor, thanks to the armored glass and compact canopy. Essential gauges weren't even inside the cockpit, but mounted on the engine nacelles outside, forcing the pilot to glance out the window mid-flight just to read them. Then there were the engines. The twin Argus. As 410s were intended for light reconnaissance planes and trainers, not a combat aircraft that was expected to lug armor, guns, and bombs into battle. At maximum output, they could only deliver around 435 horsepower each in practice, less than originally promised. Combined with the weight of armor plating around the cockpit and engines, the HS-129 struggled to even get off the ground, let alone maneuver effectively. Flight tests revealed the problems immediately. Handling was sluggish, climbing ability was poor, and performance in dives was dangerously unstable. One prototype even crashed when its control surfaces locked up during a test dive. Simply put, the HS-129 was born compromised, designed to be survivable, but too weak to ever shine. Still, the Luftwaffe pushed forward. The theory was that massed numbers of these cheap attackers could compensate for their flaws. In reality, the HS-129 entered the war already carrying the baggage of its bargain bin origins, an aircraft weighed down not only by armor, but by compromises baked into its very DNA. The first HS-129 prototypes rolled out in 1939, and almost immediately the flaws were impossible to ignore. On paper, the plane seemed promising: armored cockpit, forward-firing cannons, and the ruggedness to dive at ground targets. But in the air, reality hit hard. The Argus engines simply didn't have the muscle to move the heavily protected frame. Pilots described the aircraft as sluggish, underpowered, and unresponsive. One of the most notorious flaws came during dive testing. When the plane entered a descent, whether shallow or steep, the control surfaces stiffened to the point of near uselessness. On January 5, 1940, the second prototype crashed during a 45-degree dive when the pilot could no longer maneuver out of it. The aircraft slammed into the ground, a chilling sign that the design was fundamentally flawed. Then there was the cockpit. Already cramped during the design stage, it turned out even worse in practice. Visibility was abysmal, with the pilot seated in what felt like an armored coffin. To make matters worse, essential engine instruments were placed outside the canopy on the nacelles, meaning the pilot had to physically look away from combat to check fuel or oil gauges. In the chaos of battle, this was borderline suicidal. Despite these glaring problems, the Luftwaffe still faced a dilemma. They needed a ground attack plane. Alternatives like the Focke-Wulf 189C offered better visibility but were equally underpowered. Neither option was a winner, but Henschel's design was cheaper and smaller, making it slightly more appealing. So instead of scrapping the project outright, the Air Ministry doubled down. The HS-129 was approved for limited production, with hopes that modifications and experience would iron out the flaws. In truth, the nightmare cockpit and chronic underperformance would haunt it for its entire career. Ironically, salvation for the HS-129 came not from German ingenuity, but from conquest. In June 1940, France surrendered to Germany, and with it came access to French factories, designs, and stockpiles. Among the spoils was the Gnome-Rhone 14M radial engine, a compact power plant that would transform the struggling HS-129 from a dead end into a workable ground attacker. The Gnome-Rhone produced about 700 horsepower, over 50% more than the underwhelming Argus engines. Though not a top-tier engine by any means, it was a significant improvement, and crucially, it was available in large numbers. For the Luftwaffe, desperate to keep aircraft production flowing without overburdening their main engine lines, it was a perfect fit. Henschel wasted no time adapting the HS-129 to fit its new heart. The fuselage was slightly enlarged, controls adjusted, and a redesigned canopy introduced. The cockpit still felt claustrophobic, but bullet-resistant glass improved visibility somewhat. Strangely, engineers kept the bizarre placement of gauges on the engine nacelles, forcing pilots to continue the awkward routine of looking outside the cockpit to check performance. In flight, the difference was dramatic, if not miraculous. Speeds rose to around 250 miles per hour, handling improved, and the aircraft finally had enough thrust to carry additional weapon packs. These could include extra machine guns, bombs, or a formidable 30mm cannon. It was still no agile dogfighter, but for strafing trucks, artillery, and lightly armored vehicles, it was now at least functional. By late 1941, the reworked design, now designated the HS-129B, entered production. It was still a compromise, a bargain bin warrior built from captured parts, but for the first time, it seemed capable of fulfilling its intended role. Against the growing tide of Soviet armor on the Eastern Front, Germany would soon put it to the test. When the HS-129B finally reached combat units in 1942, its real-world performance revealed the stark difference between theory and practice. On paper, it was now a functional ground attacker, armed with cannons and bombs, protected by armor, and equipped with a sturdier engine. But the battlefield has a way of exposing flaws, and for the HS-129, the verdict depended heavily on where it was deployed. In North Africa, the aircraft struggled almost immediately. The deserts of Libya and Tunisia proved merciless on its engines. Sand and dust clogged the air intakes, filters proved inadequate, and mechanical failures became routine. Exhaust systems were poorly designed, causing reduced engine efficiency and frequent breakdowns. For a plane that already required every ounce of power to stay relevant, these setbacks were crippling. Many HS-129s simply failed before they could make a real impact. Pilots often cursed the machine, calling it unreliable and temperamental. Yet on the Eastern Front, the story was different. Against the Soviet Union's massive armored forces, the HS-129 found its niche. Outfitted with under-fuselage pods carrying 30mm cannons, it became a specialized tank hunter. Light and medium Soviet vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, and artillery positions were highly vulnerable to its strafing runs. Even heavier tanks like the T-34 could be damaged if the aircraft dove steeply and struck from above, where armor was thinner. It wasn't foolproof, but it worked often enough to give German forces a valuable tool. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 was the high watermark for the HS-129. Deployed alongside Stukas and Ju-88s, it contributed to the destruction of thousands of Soviet vehicles. Crews respected its ability to soak up ground fire. The armored cockpit could withstand rifle and machine gun rounds that would shred lighter aircraft. But survivability came at a cost. Maneuverability and speed remained poor. Pilots often described flying the HS-129 as wrestling with a stubborn mule, strong, stubbornly durable, but unwilling to respond with finesse. In the end, combat exposed the plane's dual identity. In Africa, it was a liability. In Russia, it was a stopgap hero, capable of doing a difficult job but never able to dominate it. For every tank it destroyed, it reminded its pilots of its limitations, surviving not through brilliance but through sheer stubbornness. By 1943, Germany's war situation was deteriorating rapidly. Soviet tank production surged, Allied bombers dominated the skies, and resources grew scarce. The Luftwaffe, desperate for any advantage, looked to wring more performance out of the HS-129. If the plane couldn't be faster or more agile, perhaps it could at least be deadlier. This mindset led to one of the most extreme experiments in aircraft armament of the entire war. The 75mm cannon-equipped HS-129B3. The gun in question was the Bordkanone 7.5, essentially an anti-tank gun adapted for airborne use. Mounted in a pod under the fuselage, it transformed the modest ground attacker into a flying artillery piece. On paper, it was devastating, capable of destroying almost any Soviet tank with a single well-placed shot. In practice, it was both awe-inspiring and absurd. The recoil, even with a muzzle brake, was enormous. Each shot rocked the entire aircraft, shaking pilot and frame alike. The added weight made the already underpowered HS-129 even more sluggish, straining its engines and reducing its ability to evade ground fire. The Luftwaffe even included a mechanism to jettison the cannon mid-flight, allowing the pilot to escape if the situation became hopeless. Only about 25 of these monstrous B-3 variants were produced, and while they did achieve some tank kills, their effectiveness was limited. Pilots had to line up perfect attack runs, expose themselves to heavy fire, and then wrestle with the aircraft as the massive gun bucked against its small frame. It was bravery mixed with desperation, proof of how far Germany was willing to go to stop the Soviet tide. Plans for even more radical upgrades existed. The HS-129C was envisioned with Italian Delta engines for more power, and the HS-129D would have mounted BMW or Jumo engines with over 1,000 horsepower each. On paper, these could have solved the aircraft's fundamental weakness, but by 1944, German industry was collapsing, and such projects remained dreams. No prototypes were ever completed. In the end, the HS-129's upgrades reflected its story. Creative, sometimes ingenious, but ultimately constrained by weak foundations. No matter how big the gun, no matter how thick the armor, it was still a bargain bin aircraft struggling to punch above its weight in a war that demanded more than it could ever give. The Henschel Hs-129 remains one of World War II's strangest aircraft, an armored, stubborn ground attacker born from compromise, built with engines no one wanted, crammed with design quirks that frustrated its pilots, and later armed with cannons so big they bordered on absurdity. It was never destined for glory. Yet its story is important. It shows how desperation shapes innovation, how even flawed machines can find a role when circumstances demand it. On the Eastern Front, the HS-129 proved that even a weak, awkward plane could make a difference, strafing tanks and artillery in battles that defined the war. But in the long run, it also proved the limits of compromise. Built from scraps powered by engines too weak to win, the HS-129 was a reminder that not every aircraft could be a legend. Some were simply survivors.